Mister, please don't marry her.
What did you just say?
She told somebody she's only marrying you because of your money.
Who told you that?
I heard her myself.
Sometimes the bravest person in the room is 3 feet tall and doesn't understand why the truth matters so much. She only knows that something is wrong, and that the man kneeling in front of her is the only adult who might actually listen. That was Melissa Roth, on the morning her whisper stopped a billionaire's wedding. Before we begin, drop the city you're watching from in the comments, and if stories about quiet courage, hidden truths, and unlikely heroes move you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. The Barnes estate had never looked more beautiful. White roses climbed the stone archway leading to the garden chapel. Rows of gold-trimmed chairs sat filled with senators, hotel developers, and old money families who'd flown in from 3 continents. A string quartet tuned quietly beneath the shade of a 100-year-old magnolia tree, and somewhere near the kitchens, the smell of champagne and fresh bread drifted out over the lawn. At the center of it all stood Lincoln Barnes, 45 years old, dressed in a midnight blue suit with a white rose pinned to his lapel. He had built Barnes Logistics from a single leased delivery van into one of the largest private freight companies on the East Coast, and in 22 years of grinding, sleepless growth, he had never once let himself believe he deserved to slow down and be happy. Today he believed it. For most of his adult life, Lincoln had measured his days in shipping manifests, quarterly earnings calls, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had built something enormous entirely on his own. He'd bought this estate 11 years ago, back when he still ate dinner standing up at his desk, and he'd spent most of that time treating it less like a home and more like a place he occasionally slept. Somewhere in the last 2 years that had started to change. In 11 minutes, he was going to marry Camille Sterling, the woman he was certain had finally given him permission to rest. He straightened his bow tie, glanced toward the chapel doors and allowed himself for the first time in years to simply feel lucky. Then something small and warm gripped the edge of his jacket. He looked down. Melissa Roth stood there in a yellow floral sundress, her curls gathered into a loose little bun, her eyes far too serious for a 3-year-old on a wedding morning. She was the daughter of Haley Roth, the estate's live-in housekeeper, a quiet, steady woman Lincoln had trusted with his home for nearly 5 years. Lincoln crouched down to her level the way he always did with Melissa, because something about her attentiveness made him feel like she deserved to be spoken to like a person and not a child. "Hey, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Melissa glanced past him toward the chapel doors. Then toward her mother, who was folding table linens near the garden entrance, careful not to look up. Melissa leaned in close, the way children do when they've decided something is too important to say out loud. "Don't marry her," she whispered. "She hurts Mommy when you leave." For a moment Lincoln didn't move. He almost smiled, the easy, indulgent smile adults give children who've clearly gotten a story tangled. "Melissa," he said gently, "what do you mean?" Her small hand tightened around a fold of his jacket. "She gets mean when you go away. She's not nice like she is when you're there." Lincoln's smile faded before he even realized it was gone. He was about to ask her to explain further when a voice came from behind him, low and unsteady. "She isn't lying." He turned. His older sister, Rachel Barnes, stood a few feet away in her pale green maid of honor dress, her face drained of color, her hands pressed together like she was holding herself in place. "Rachel. I've seen it too," she said quietly. "For months. The way she changes the second you're not in the room. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I had no right to say anything, not after what happened with you and Diane. I swore I'd never interfere in your life again unless I was sure." Her voice cracked. "I'm sure now, Lincoln." Before Lincoln could respond, before he could even fully absorb what his sister had just said, quick footsteps crossed the gravel path behind them. Marcus Reed, his head of security for the last 8 years, arrived slightly out of breath, a tablet gripped tightly in both hands. "Mr. Barnes." Marcus's voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who had trained himself not to sound alarmed even when he was. "I need 5 minutes before this ceremony starts." "Marcus, we're 11 minutes out." "Sir." Marcus lowered his voice, glancing once at Melissa, then at Haley across the lawn. "One of the hallway cameras caught something this morning. I think you need to see it before you walk down that aisle." Lincoln looked at the tablet in Marcus's hands. Then at his sister's pale, frightened face. then down at Melissa, who was still watching him with that unbearable, unchildlike patience, as if she had been waiting weeks for someone, anyone, to finally ask her the right question. Somewhere behind them, the string quartet began to play the opening notes of the processional. Lincoln did not move toward the chapel. "Show me," he said quietly. Marcus turned the tablet toward him. Lincoln's eyes dropped to the screen. Whatever he saw there, it changed his face completely, the color leaving it the same way it had left his sister's. He did not say a word. He simply stood there in his wedding suit, 11 minutes before the biggest ceremony of his life, staring at something that was about to end it before it began. Behind him, the quartet reached the swell of the processional, waiting for a groom who was no longer listening. Rachel reached out and touched his arm as if to steady him, or perhaps to steady herself. Melissa, still holding a fistful of his jacket, looked up at the two adults whose faces had gone gray and quiet, and understood, in the simple, absolute way that children understand things, that she had done the right thing by telling. She did not yet know what was on that screen. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, someone was finally about to find out the truth. 3 weeks earlier, no one at the Barnes estate would have believed a single word of what was coming. Camille Sterling had a gift for making rooms feel warmer the moment she walked into them. She remembered the names of every valet, every florist, every junior assistant who'd only met her once. She volunteered 2 Saturdays a month at a downtown children's literacy program and never mentioned it unless someone else brought it up first. At the gala where she and Lincoln had met nearly 2 years earlier, she had spent 20 minutes in a quiet corner talking to an elderly widow that half the room had politely ignored, and Lincoln, watching from across the ballroom, had decided right then that he wanted to know a woman who did that. He had spent 22 years building Barnes logistics out of a single leased van and a stubborn refusal to fail, and somewhere in that climb he had learned to trust 2 things above almost everything else: numbers and loyalty. Camille in those early months seemed to offer him both. She was precise, composed, and endlessly patient with the chaos of his schedule. She never once made him feel like his success was the only interesting thing about him. He told Rachel more than once, finally found peace. Haley Roth had worked at the estate for nearly 5 years by then, ever since her husband's death left her raising Melissa alone on a widow's pension that didn't stretch nearly far enough. Lincoln had hired her not out of pity but because she was, by a wide margin, the most reliable person who'd ever applied for the position. Punctual, thorough, and fiercely private about her own life. She asked for nothing beyond her wages and never once brought her troubles into his home. When Melissa's preschool shut its doors temporarily for a building repair, Lincoln hadn't hesitated. "Bring her with you," he'd said. "Every house is better with a kid running around it." So for 3 weeks, Melissa had spent her mornings in a corner of whichever room her mother was cleaning, coloring quietly, humming songs to herself, watching everything with the wide, unblinking attention that only very young children still have, before the world teaches them to stop noticing. She noticed faces. She noticed when smiles reached people's eyes and when they didn't. She noticed the particular way grown-ups changed their voices depending on who was listening. She couldn't have explained any of this if you'd asked her. She simply filed it away the way children do, without judgment, waiting to understand it later. The first afternoon Melissa saw something strange. It was raining lightly outside, and Lincoln had just stepped out of the dining room to take a call from his logistics director in Atlanta. Camille was overseeing the seating chart at the long mahogany table, and Haley was rearranging a vase of white ranunculus near the window exactly the way the florist had instructed. The moment Lincoln's footsteps faded down the hall, something in Camille's face shifted, quick and total, like a light switching off. "Did I ask for these flowers to be arranged like this?" Her voice had dropped into something flat and cold that Melissa had never heard her use before. Haley looked up, startled. "No, ma'am. I was following the florist's card." "Then maybe," Camille said, stepping closer, "you should learn to think instead of just following instructions like you're incapable of anything else." Melissa, half hidden behind a dining chair with her coloring book, went very still. Camille reached out and closed her hand around Haley's wrist, not violently, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough that Haley's breath caught audibly in her throat. "Remember whose house this is going to be after tomorrow?" Camille said quietly. "Remember your place, Haley?" Footsteps sounded again in the hallway. Camille released Haley's wrist instantly, smoothing the front of her dress in one practiced motion. By the time Lincoln walked back through the doorway, phone tucked into his pocket, Camille was smiling, warm, easy, unbothered. "Everything's perfect in here," she told him, and she said it so naturally that Lincoln didn't so much as glance at Haley, who was already back to arranging flowers with her head down. Melissa stared at Camille from behind the chair, her small hands gripping her crayon so tightly it left a mark on her palm. She didn't have the words yet for what she'd just watched. She only knew, with the plain certainty children carry before the world complicates it out of them, that Camille's face had changed like a light switching off and on again, and that her mother's wrist was still red. She said nothing that day, but she remembered. That evening, after Camille had left for her own apartment across town and the estate had gone quiet, Melissa sat on the edge of her mother's bed while Haley brushed out her curls before bath time. "Mommy," Melissa said, "why did your arm turn red?" Haley's hands went still for half a second before she resumed brushing, her voice carefully light. "I bumped it on the table, sweetheart." "Silly me." Melissa didn't argue. She was 3, not foolish, and something in the way her mother's eyes wouldn't quite meet hers told her that the answer wasn't the whole truth. But she also understood, in the wordless way small children absorb the emotional weather of a house, that pressing further would only make her mother more tired than she already looked. So she let it go that night, and simply leaned her head against her mother's shoulder until the brushing stopped. Down the hall, Rachel Barnes stood in the doorway of her guest suite, phone in hand, staring at nothing in particular. She'd caught the tail end of something on her way past the dining room 20 minutes earlier, not the words, just the tone, sharp and unfamiliar, gone by the time she'd rounded the corner to look. She told herself she'd imagined it. She had a long, uncomfortable history of imagining the worst about the women her brother loved, and she wasn't eager to repeat it. So she said nothing to Lincoln that night either. Neither of them yet understood that their silence, however well-intentioned, was quietly becoming its own kind of danger. Over the days that followed, Melissa began to notice a pattern, though she wouldn't have called it that. She only knew that a kind of quiet math was happening in the house, one she was starting to solve without meaning to. Lincoln leaves. Camille changes. Lincoln comes back. Camille changes again. She saw it happen with a young server named Priya, who'd been hired for the week to help with wedding preparations. Priya had set a tray of crystal glasses down slightly off-center on the sideboard, and the moment Lincoln stepped out to sign for a flower delivery, Camille had descended on her with a voice so cutting that Priya's hands shook visibly rearranging the tray. By the time Lincoln returned, Camille was laughing warmly at something the wedding planner had said, and Priya was blinking hard by the coat closet, pretending to check her phone. She saw it with one of the gardeners, an older man named Walter who'd tended the estate's roses for 19 years. Camille told him, in front of Melissa and nobody else, that his work was sloppy and that she'd be making changes to the landscaping staff after the wedding. Walter said nothing. He simply nodded and kept clipping, his jaw tight, until Lincoln's car pulled back up the drive and Camille's voice softened into something almost musical. And she saw it more than once with her own mother, small things mostly. A room that had already been cleaned, ordered, redone. A comment about Haley's attitude that made no sense to Melissa, because her mother never raised her voice to anyone. Each time, the cruelty vanished the instant Lincoln's footsteps sounded nearby, replaced by something so convincingly warm that Melissa found herself doubting her own memory. One evening, curled against her mother on the small couch in their staff apartment, Melissa finally asked the question she'd been turning over for days. "Mommy, why does Miss Camille make you sad?" Haley went very still. She set down the sock she'd been folding and knelt in front of her daughter, taking both of Melissa's small hands in hers. "Sweetheart, you don't need to worry about grown-up things like that." "But she is mean," Melissa insisted, her small brow furrowed with the seriousness only children bring to injustice. "She's mean when Mr. Lincoln goes away. Why does she stop being mean when he's there?" Haley's throat tightened. She glanced instinctively toward the door, as if the walls themselves might repeat what her daughter had said. "Melissa, please don't say that to anyone else, okay? Not to Mr. Lincoln, not to Miss Rachel. Just, not right now." "Why?" Haley pulled her daughter into her lap, resting her chin on top of Melissa's curls so she wouldn't have to look at her while she answered. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "telling the truth causes trouble, especially when the person you're telling it to doesn't want to believe it. And I need this job, sweetheart. I need it for us. If I say the wrong thing to the wrong person, we could lose our apartment. You could lose your school. I can't risk that. Not yet." It wasn't cowardice, though Haley sometimes lay awake wondering if it was. It was arithmetic. The brutal, narrow arithmetic of a single mother with no family safety net and a landlord's daughter's future resting on a paycheck that came from the very estate where her cruelty was happening. She had run the numbers 100 times in her head, and every version ended the same way. Speaking up cost more than she could afford to lose. Melissa didn't fully understand the reasoning. But she understood her mother's fear, because fear has its own language that children read fluently long before they can read words. She nodded against her mother's chest and said nothing more that night. Rachel, too, was accumulating her own quiet evidence. She'd started, almost without meaning to, watching Camille the way you watch weather, for changes in pressure. She noticed the half-second delay before Camille's smile arrived whenever Lincoln entered a room, as though it had to be summoned rather than felt. She noticed how differently Camille spoke to the household staff when she believed no one important was listening. She still said nothing. The memory of Diane, a woman Rachel had once judged so harshly, so wrongly, that her brother hadn't spoken to her for the better part of a year, sat heavy in her chest every time she considered saying something now. She had promised herself after that she would never again interfere in Lincoln's relationships unless she was completely, unshakably certain. She was getting closer to certain. She just didn't know it yet. It was 3 days before the wedding when Melissa saw the moment that finally cracked something open inside her. She was sitting on the back staircase with her doll, half out of sight, when she saw Camille grip her mother's arm again. Harder this time, hard enough that Haley's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away before anyone else could see. Melissa didn't move. She didn't cry out. She simply sat very still on the stairs, clutching her doll, and understood something with total 3-year-old clarity. This wasn't just Camille being unkind, the way grown-ups were sometimes unkind about small things and forgot about it an hour later. Her mother was afraid. And her mother was never afraid of anything. By the night before the wedding, the estate had transformed into something out of a magazine spread. String lights threaded through the magnolia trees, a dance floor being leveled on the south lawn, a small army of caterers testing menu items in the kitchen until nearly midnight. Camille moved through it all like she already owned it, which, in a sense, she was about to. She had started speaking differently to the staff over those final days. Not around Lincoln, never around Lincoln, but in the in-between moments when she believed no one who mattered was watching. To the catering coordinator, she mentioned that things would be run more efficiently after tomorrow. To the wedding planner's assistant, she made an offhand comment about staff who wouldn't be kept on much longer. She was rehearsing a kind of ownership, trying the words on for size before she had any actual right to them. Haley felt it more than anyone. She'd spent the better part of the week trying to stay in rooms Camille wasn't in, a quiet, exhausting choreography that Melissa had noticed without fully understanding. It finally caught up with her the evening before the ceremony, while Haley was smoothing the linens in the guest suite where Camille's sister would be staying. Camille appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing the calm, pleasant expression she always wore when Lincoln might be within earshot. Except tonight, Lincoln was 2 floors down in his study, and both women knew it. "You won't have him protecting you forever, you know," Camille said, stepping into the room and closing the door most of the way behind her. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "Tomorrow I become part of this family. And things are going to look very different around here." Haley kept her eyes on the linens, her hands moving carefully, deliberately. "Yes, ma'am." "You've had a nice run," Camille continued, playing the loyal, humble little housekeeper Lincoln feels so sorry for. "But that ends tomorrow. I'd start thinking, if I were you, about how replaceable you actually are." Haley said nothing. She had learned, over the past several months, that silence ended these conversations faster than any response could. What neither woman noticed was Melissa, seated cross-legged just outside the half-open door with her coloring book forgotten in her lap, listening to every word. That night, after Camille had finally gone to sleep in her own wing of the house, Haley sat on the edge of Melissa's bed and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered, more to herself than to Melissa, who she assumed was already asleep, "just don't make any trouble, okay? Please." Melissa's eyes opened. "But why, Mommy?" Haley startled, then sighed, smoothing her daughter's curls back from her face. "Because I need this job, sweetheart. I need it for us. And sometimes the safest thing to do is stay quiet, even when it doesn't feel fair." Melissa didn't answer. But something in her small chest had been building for days now, a pressure she didn't have words for, only knew as a kind of ache that grew every time she watched her mother swallow her fear and smile anyway. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and warm, exactly the kind of morning wedding planners pray for. The estate buzzed with 100 small, urgent tasks. Melissa, dressed early in her yellow floral sundress so she wouldn't be underfoot during the final preparations, wandered the edges of the chaos with her doll tucked under one arm. She saw it happen one final time near the staircase, barely 20 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. Lincoln had just stepped outside to greet an arriving guest. The moment his footsteps faded, Camille cornered Haley by the banister, her voice dropping into that same cold, private register. "Today you remember your place," Camille said. "For good." Haley lowered her eyes and said nothing, the way she always did. But Melissa, watching from a few feet away with her doll clutched tight against her chest, felt something inside her finally break loose from wherever it had been holding still. She thought of every time she'd watched her mother's eyes fill with tears she wasn't allowed to cry. She thought of every warm smile Camille wore the second Lincoln reappeared, like flipping a switch. She thought of her mother telling her, again and again, not to make trouble, and she understood, with a clarity that felt too large for her small body, that someone had to. So when Melissa spotted Lincoln standing near the chapel entrance, adjusting his bow tie, glancing at his watch, 11 minutes from a wedding he believed would be the happiest day of his life, she ran. Her small feet pounded across the gravel path. She reached him just as he turned, and she grabbed the edge of his jacket with both hands, breathless, her heart hammering harder than it ever had before. He knelt down immediately, the way he always did for her. "Hey, what's wrong, sweetheart?" Melissa looked back once, toward her mother folding linens near the garden entrance, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Then she looked at Lincoln, and she said the words she'd been carrying for weeks, the words that would end a wedding before it began. "Don't marry her," she whispered. "She hurts Mommy when you leave." Lincoln didn't move for a long moment after Melissa's whisper landed. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, almost gentle, the voice of a man trying not to spook something fragile. "What did she do to Mommy, sweetheart? Can you tell me?" Melissa struggled, the way 3-year-olds struggle with feelings too large for the vocabulary they have. "She's mean," she said again, her small hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "She's mean when you go. She's nice when you come back. She holds Mommy's arm too hard." It wasn't a complete account. It wasn't evidence in any legal sense. But paired with Rachel's pale, unsteady confirmation moments earlier, it was enough, more than enough, for Lincoln to feel something cold settle into his chest where, minutes earlier, there had only been anticipation. He turned to Marcus, who was still holding the tablet, and he said the only thing that mattered. "I want the truth. All of it. However long it takes." He didn't tell Marcus what conclusion to reach. He simply told him to look. Marcus retreated to the security office just off the main hallway, and Lincoln followed, Rachel close behind him, Melissa's small hand now folded tightly into her mother's, both of them waiting anxiously near the doorway while the men reviewed footage. The first clip Marcus pulled up showed the dining room, timestamped 3 weeks earlier. Haley crossed the frame carrying a stack of folded linens. Lincoln's own figure could be seen exiting through the far door. The moment he was gone, Camille entered the frame from the opposite side, and her posture changed instantly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting, her expression hardening into something Lincoln didn't recognize from 2 years of knowing her. He watched her grip Haley's wrist. He watched Haley's face tighten in pain she was clearly trying not to show. He watched the whole exchange end the second his own footsteps became audible again on the recording. Watched Camille's face soften back into warmth so fast it looked almost mechanical. "There's more," Marcus said quietly and kept scrolling. More footage surfaced, Camille berating the young server Priya over a tray of glasses, her voice sharp enough that Priya flinched even on the recording. Camille cornering Walter the gardener, threatening his job in a tone so casual it was almost worse than shouting. Camille, again and again, transforming the instant Lincoln left a room and transforming back the instant he returned, like an actress switching between 2 different roles depending on her audience. Rachel had gone completely silent, one hand pressed over her mouth. "How long?" Lincoln finally asked, his voice low. "Has this been happening?" Marcus didn't look up from the screen. "Based on what I'm seeing, sir, longer than anyone realized. She's careful. She almost always waits until she's sure you're actually gone, not just stepping out for a second. That's not impulsive behavior. That's someone who knows exactly where the cameras are and exactly how much time she has. The implication sat heavily in the room. This wasn't a woman who'd lost her temper once, under stress, during a chaotic wedding week. This was a pattern, deliberate and sustained, hidden with the kind of precision that suggested Camille had been managing two entirely separate versions of herself for months, possibly longer. Lincoln thought of every dinner where Camille had charmed his business partners. Every gala where she'd knelt beside an elderly widow no one else had bothered to speak to. He thought about how completely he had believed in that version of her, and how thoroughly that belief was now collapsing under the weight of a security tablet. "Keep going," he said quietly. Marcus scrolled further into footage from just the past few days, and his expression shifted, a flicker of something close to alarm. "Sir, there's a section here she seems to have specifically asked to be reviewed by our external contractor. Said one of the hallway units was malfunctioning. I want to see what's actually on it before." The office door opened. Camille stood in the frame, still in her robe, her hair half-pinned for the ceremony, her eyes moving from Lincoln's face to the tablet in Marcus's hands and back again. "What," she said slowly, "is going on in here?" For a moment nobody answered. Lincoln looked at her. Really looked at her, the way you look at someone when the picture you've had of them for 2 years suddenly refuses to line up with what's in front of you. Camille's eyes flicked to the tablet again, and something passed behind them, gone almost as fast as it arrived. "Fear maybe. Or calculation. We're reviewing some footage," Lincoln said carefully. "Before the ceremony. On our wedding day?" Camille let out a short laugh, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Lincoln, that's ridiculous. What could possibly be so urgent that it can't wait a few hours?" Marcus didn't offer an answer, and neither did Lincoln. The silence stretched long enough that Camille's practiced composure began to slip at the edges, a hairline crack in a surface that had, until 11 minutes ago, never once shown a flaw. "Is this about that child?" she said finally, her voice sharpening. "Whatever she said to you, Lincoln, she's 3. 3-year-olds say all kinds of things. They mix up dreams and reality. You cannot possibly be about to delay our wedding because a toddler got confused about something she saw on television." "Rachel saw it too," Lincoln said quietly. "More than once." Camille's gaze snapped to Rachel, standing pale and rigid near the doorway. "Rachel has never liked me. You know that. She didn't like Diane either, if I remember the stories correctly." Rachel flinched but didn't back down. "This isn't the same thing, Camille. This isn't a feeling I can't explain. I've seen your face change the second Lincoln leaves a room. I've seen it more times than I can count, and I told myself I was imagining it because I didn't want to be the sister who ruins things again. I was wrong to stay quiet. I won't be wrong twice." Camille's jaw tightened. She turned back to Lincoln, and her voice softened, took on the warm, persuasive tone he'd fallen in love with 2 years ago, the tone that had always, until this exact moment, worked. "Lincoln, sweetheart. Whatever you think you're about to see, I promise you there's an explanation. Please, can we talk about this after the ceremony? Everyone is waiting. 200 people are sitting outside right now." Lincoln didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the tablet still in Marcus's hands, at the paused frame of a version of Camille he had never once been allowed to see, and he understood, with a kind of quiet devastation, that the 200 people waiting outside were far less important than the truth sitting in his own hands. "Give us a few more minutes, Camille," he said finally. "Then we'll talk. All of us." Camille left the security office with her composure visibly fraying, and the moment the door clicked shut behind her, Marcus turned back to the tablet with a new urgency. "She knows we're on to her now," he said. "I want to lock down access to the archive before she thinks to ask someone to touch it." He wasn't fast enough. 10 minutes later, one of the junior security techs, a young man named Devon who handled the overnight monitoring shifts, knocked hesitantly on the office door. "Sir, Miss Sterling just asked me to pull the footage from hallway camera 4. Said you wanted it deleted before the ceremony. Said there was some kind of malfunction you'd already discussed with her." Marcus's expression went flat. "I never said that." Devon's face paled. "She was very specific, sir. She said it came directly from you." "It didn't," Lincoln said, his voice low and hard in a way none of them had heard from him before. "Marcus, secure everything. Every file, every backup, right now." While Marcus worked, Rachel slipped out into the hallway and nearly collided with Walter, the estate's longtime gardener, who was hovering near the side entrance with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Miss Barnes," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder, "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it to your brother too before that ceremony starts." Rachel led him straight back to the security office. "I was trimming the hedge outside the east terrace about 20 minutes ago," Walter said, twisting his cap in his hands. "Miss Sterling didn't know I was there. The boxwood's tall enough to hide a man my size if I'm crouched down. She was on her phone with someone and she said, I heard it clear as day, she said, I don't care what it takes, get that footage gone before Lincoln sees it. If he finds out what's actually on there, everything falls apart." The room went very still. "She said, everything falls apart," Lincoln repeated slowly, "like there's more than what we've already seen." "That's what it sounded like to me, sir." Lincoln pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, absorbing the shape of what was happening. Not a single lapse in temper, not a misunderstanding, but a woman actively working, in real time, on her own wedding morning, to bury evidence of who she actually was. He thought of Haley then, and where she must be, and what 5 years of silence had cost her. He found her a few minutes later in the small laundry room off the kitchen, folding towels with hands that weren't quite steady. "Haley." His voice was gentler than she'd expected. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth even if it's hard to say." Haley didn't look up. "Yes, sir?" "Has Camille ever hurt you?" The towel in her hands went still. For a long moment she said nothing at all, and Lincoln watched 5 years of careful, exhausted self-protection war with itself behind her eyes. "I can't lose this job," she finally said, so quietly he almost missed it. "I have nowhere else to take Melissa. I don't have family who can help. If I say something and you don't believe me, or if it just makes things worse." "I already believe you," Lincoln said. "I've seen the footage, Haley. I've heard what Walter overheard 20 minutes ago. I'm not asking you to convince me of anything. I'm asking because you deserve to finally say it out loud to someone who already knows it's true." Something in Haley broke open then, quietly, the way a dam gives after holding back far more than it was ever built to hold. She told him everything. The wrist-grabbing, the threats about her job, the constant, exhausting calculation of trying to stay in whichever room Camille wasn't in, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she was overreacting, if she was the problem, if she'd somehow invited this by being too quiet, too easy to corner. "I stayed silent," she said, tears finally slipping free, "because I thought silence was the only thing keeping a roof over my daughter's head. I didn't think anyone would believe a housekeeper over the woman about to become Mrs. Barnes." Lincoln stood there for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what his home had become without his knowledge. A place where a woman who worked for him had been too afraid to tell him the truth, because she'd correctly understood that his fiancée held more power in that house than he'd ever realized. "You should never have had to choose," he said finally, "between telling the truth and protecting your daughter. That's on me for not seeing it sooner. Not on you." Haley wiped her face with the back of her hand, still not quite able to believe she was being spoken to this way, like a person whose fear had been reasonable, rather than an inconvenience to be managed. "I didn't want to be the reason it fell apart," she said. "I kept thinking if I just get through the wedding, if I just keep my head down, maybe it gets better once things settle." "It doesn't get better," Lincoln said quietly. "Not with someone who only shows you who they are when they think no one's watching. It just gets better hidden." Outside, the sound of the quartet drifted faintly through the open window, still playing, still waiting, the guests still unaware that anything at all was wrong. Lincoln glanced toward the sound, then back at Haley, and something in his expression hardened into resolve. "I need you to know something," he said. "Whatever happens in the next hour, your job isn't in question. It was never in question. The only person in this house who should be worried about tomorrow is Camille." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Haley allowed herself to believe him completely. Lincoln found Camille in the garden beneath the flowered arch where, in less than an hour, they were supposed to have exchanged vows in front of 200 witnesses. She turned when she heard him approach, and for a moment, the old smile arrived automatically, reflexively, before she seemed to remember that it no longer had anywhere useful to land. "There you are," she said, her voice pitched carefully bright. "Everyone's getting restless. We really should." She stopped when she saw his face. Whatever she'd been about to say dissolved on her tongue, replaced by the particular stillness of someone recalculating in real time. "I've seen the footage," Lincoln said. "All of it. And I know about the call you made to have it deleted. Her smile vanished completely this time, and for one unguarded second, Lincoln saw something underneath it, something colder and more calculating than anything he'd witnessed in 2 years of loving her. Footage can be misleading, she said, recovering quickly. You're looking at seconds, Lincoln, out of context. Haley's always been sensitive. She misunderstands things. Rachel saw the same pattern, independent of anything on camera. Rachel has never wanted you to be happy with anyone who isn't her idea of good enough. Marcus refused to delete evidence at your request, and you threatened his position for it. He's exaggerating to protect his job. Walter overheard you on the phone 20 minutes ago, Lincoln said, and watched something behind Camille's eyes finally falter. Telling whoever you called that if I found out what was actually on that footage, everything would fall apart. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant, oblivious music of the quartet, still playing for a ceremony that both of them now understood would never happen. Camille tried one more angle, softer this time, almost pleading. Lincoln, think about what we've built together. Think about the gala circuit, the partnerships, the way people look at us when we walk into a room. Do you really want to blow all of that up over a housekeeper's bruised feelings? Bruised feelings, Lincoln repeated slowly, and something in his voice went very quiet and very hard. Camille, I watched footage of you gripping her wrist hard enough that she flinched. I watched you threaten a gardener who's worked here longer than you and I have known each other. I watched you humiliate a 20-year-old server over a tray of glasses. That's not bruised feelings. That's a pattern you built carefully enough to hide from me for months. You're really going to throw away 2 years, Camille said finally, her voice low, because a 3-year-old whispered something to you on your way down the aisle? No, Lincoln said. I'm not choosing her word over yours. I'm choosing the evidence. Hours of it. From cameras you didn't know I'd have reviewed, corroborated by my sister, my head of security, my gardener, and a housekeeper who was too afraid of you to say a single word about it for months. Camille's composure cracked fully then, the mask she'd worn so convincingly for 2 years finally slipping all the way off. You have no idea what it's like, she snapped, living in the shadow of people like Haley, people everyone feels sorry for, people who get treated like saints just for being quiet and humble while I have to actually perform, every single day, to be taken seriously in rooms full of people who assume I only got here because of you. I wanted this house run properly. I wanted people who understood their place before I had to spend years earning the right to say so. That's not running a house properly, Lincoln said quietly. That's cruelty with a schedule. And the fact that you only showed it when you thought I wasn't looking tells me you always knew exactly how wrong it was. Camille said nothing for a long moment, and in the silence, something in her expression settled into something almost like resignation, not remorse, but the flat acceptance of someone whose plan had simply, finally, run out of road. The person you underestimated the most in this entire house, Lincoln continued, was a 3-year-old girl you probably never thought twice about. She watched you for weeks. She understood exactly what you were, long before any of the adults around her were brave enough to say it out loud. Camille's jaw tightened. What are you going to do? Lincoln looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, though the anger was there, but with something closer to grief for the 2 years he'd spent believing in a version of her that had never fully existed. I'm going to tell the truth, he said, to everyone waiting out there. And then I'm going to make sure Haley and Melissa never have to be afraid in this house again. He turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at her one final time. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you're a monster, Camille. I think you're someone who decided, somewhere along the way, that kindness was a performance you only owed to people who could see you. That's not a small flaw. It's the whole foundation cracking. I just wish I'd understood that before I asked 200 people to watch me marry it. Camille had no answer for that. For the first time since he'd known her, she simply had nothing left to say. He turned and walked back toward the chapel, leaving Camille standing alone beneath the arch of white roses that had been meant to frame the happiest moment of her life, and instead now framed the end of it. The chapel was full when Lincoln walked in, every gold-trimmed chair occupied, sunlight pouring gold through the open sides of the tent, the string quartet still playing the same soft processional they'd been cycling through for the better part of 20 minutes, waiting for a bride who was no longer coming. Lincoln walked down the aisle alone. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd, guests turning to whisper to one another, the quartet's music faltering and finally stopping altogether as the last musician noticed something was wrong. Somewhere near the front, a business partner of Lincoln's leaned toward his wife and murmured a question no one could answer. Near the back, a florist's assistant froze mid-step, an armful of boutonnieres still clutched against her chest, unsure whether to keep moving or simply stand still. Lincoln reached the front of the chapel and turned to face the 200 people who had traveled, in some cases across entire continents, to watch him get married. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady despite everything churning underneath it. "I know this isn't how any of us expected this morning to go." He paused, glancing briefly toward the back of the tent, where Rachel stood near the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Haley's shoulder. Melissa peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, clutching her doll. "The wedding will not be taking place today," Lincoln said simply. The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence that seems to physically press against a room. He didn't offer a detailed explanation. He didn't list Camille's cruelties in front of 200 strangers, didn't turn the moment into a public reckoning, though he easily could have. He simply said what needed to be said and let the truth of it stand on its own. "I found out this morning that the woman I was about to marry was not who I believed her to be," he continued. "I won't go into details that aren't mine to share publicly. But I'd rather stand here and disappoint all of you than stand at that altar and marry someone I no longer trust. I'm sorry for the inconvenience to everyone who traveled to be here. There will be transportation and accommodations covered for anyone who needs it." He stepped down from the small platform amid a rising murmur of shocked conversation. Guests already reaching for phones, whispering behind cupped hands, some rising to leave immediately, others sitting frozen in their seats, unsure what etiquette applied to a wedding that had just publicly, quietly dissolved. Rachel met him halfway down the aisle and wrapped both arms around him without a word. "I should have said something weeks ago," she whispered against his shoulder. "I almost let you marry her because I was scared of being wrong again." "You weren't wrong," Lincoln said. "You were just afraid, same as Haley was. I understand that now." He found Haley waiting near the back, Melissa still pressed close against her side, and he crouched down to Melissa's height, the way he always did. "You did something very brave today," he told her. "Do you understand that?" Melissa considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Is Mr. Lincoln still going to marry Miss Camille?" she asked her mother, tugging on Haley's sleeve, still working out the shape of what had happened. Haley knelt beside her. "No, sweetheart. He isn't." Melissa nodded slowly, satisfied, and turned back to Lincoln with the simple, unclouded relief of a child who has finally been believed. "Good," she said. "She's not nice." Lincoln let out a breath that was half laugh, half something closer to heartbreak, and reached out to gently touch the top of her curly bun. "No," he agreed. "She isn't. But you were. You were the only one brave enough to tell me the truth." Behind them, the wedding staff had already begun the strange, silent work of dismantling a ceremony that would never happen. Folding unused programs, quietly wheeling away trays of champagne flutes that would go untouched, the white roses along the chapel arch drooping slightly now in the midday sun, beautiful and entirely pointless. Lincoln stood in the middle of it all and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the morning, that he hadn't lost a wedding today. He'd been saved from one. Marcus approached quietly a few minutes later, phone in hand. "Miss Sterling's car just left the property," he said. "I've had her personal items packed and sent to the gatehouse, per your instructions. Security's confirmed she's off the estate." Lincoln nodded, feeling less relief than he expected. Mostly a kind of tired, hollowed-out clarity, the aftermath of adrenaline finally settling. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything this morning. I know that wasn't an easy position to be in." "Wasn't hard, sir," Marcus said simply. "You asked for the truth. I just went and found it." Rachel stayed close by his side as the last of the guests filtered out, many of them pausing to offer quiet, awkward condolences that Lincoln accepted with more grace than he felt. It wasn't grief exactly that sat in his chest as the tent slowly emptied. It was something closer to the strange, disorienting relief of a man who'd nearly walked off a cliff in the dark and only just noticed the edge in time. By early afternoon, the estate had gone quiet in a completely different way than it had been that morning, no longer buzzing with anticipation, but settling instead into something calmer, steadier, like a house exhaling after holding its breath for months. 2 days after the wedding that never happened, Lincoln found Haley in the small laundry room again, folding towels the way she always did, as if returning to routine work was the only way she knew how to steady herself. "Come sit with me for a minute," he said. "I want to talk to you about something, and it isn't a reprimand, I promise." She followed him to his study, Melissa trailing behind, and sat stiffly in the chair across from his desk while he slid a folder across to her. "I want you to know first," Lincoln said, "that none of what happened these past few months was your fault. Not one part of it. You did the only thing that made sense given what you were facing. You protected your daughter the best way you knew how, with no safety net and no one you trusted to believe you. That's not weakness, Haley. That's survival." Haley opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a new employment contract, estate operations manager, a title she hadn't expected, alongside a salary figure that made her breath catch, full benefits, and a clause granting her and Melissa the use of the private cottage near the Eastern Gardens rent-free, for as long as she remained with the estate. "Lincoln, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he told her. "You spent 5 years taking care of this house without ever once asking for more than you were owed. It's time this house took care of you." Tears slipped down Haley's face before she could stop them, and this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, they weren't tears she had to hide. Over the following weeks, Lincoln quietly overhauled the way the estate operated. He instituted a direct, confidential reporting line that went straight to him and Marcus, bypassing any single household authority entirely, so no employee would ever again have to weigh their safety against their job security. He met individually with every member of staff, Priya, Walter, the caterers, the groundskeepers, not to interrogate them about Camille, but simply to ask plainly whether they'd ever felt unsafe or unheard in his home. The answers, some of them, were harder to hear than he expected. He listened to all of them. Rachel found him one evening on the back terrace, watching the sun go down over the gardens that had so recently been dressed for a wedding that never happened. "I keep thinking about how close I came to saying nothing," she admitted, sitting down beside him. "If Melissa hadn't said something first, I don't know if I ever would have found the courage." "You were afraid of being wrong," Lincoln said. "I understand that better than you'd think. And that fear almost let something much worse happen," Rachel said quietly. "I don't think I'll ever let myself go quiet again, Lincoln. Not about something that matters." He reached over and squeezed her hand, and neither of them said much else. They didn't need to. Months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Lincoln unveiled a small reading corner he'd built into the corner of the estate's library, a low bookshelf stocked with picture books, a soft rug, a child-sized armchair positioned by the window where the afternoon light fell warmest. Above the bookshelf hung a small brass plaque, simple and unassuming, that read, "Melissa's Corner, because the smallest voices can tell the greatest truths." Melissa, now visiting the library with her mother most afternoons after her promoted position freed up more of Haley's time to simply be present, ran her small fingers over the engraved letters and beamed with the particular, uncomplicated pride of a child who has just been told, in the clearest way possible, that she mattered. "Is this really mine?" she asked, looking up at Lincoln. "It's really yours," he said, settling into the armchair across from her small one. "You earned it." Melissa considered this with her usual seriousness, then climbed into her chair and picked up a picture book, flipping through it slowly. After a moment she looked up again. "Mommy isn't scared anymore, right?" Lincoln glanced toward the doorway where Haley stood watching them both, a soft, unguarded smile on her face, the kind of smile that had nothing to prove and nowhere else it needed to be. "No, sweetheart," Lincoln said. "She isn't scared anymore." Melissa nodded, satisfied, and returned to her book, already losing herself in the pictures the way only small children can, fully present, fully safe, the fear that had shadowed her mother for months finally, completely gone. Lincoln watched her for a long moment, thinking back to that morning beneath the flowered arch, the wedding he'd almost walked into blind, the truth he'd almost missed entirely if not for one small, insistent voice that refused to stay quiet. He thought about all the adults in that house who had noticed something was wrong and said nothing, himself included in his own way for trusting a surface without ever questioning what it was covering. It had taken the bravest, smallest person in the entire estate to finally break that silence open. Sometimes, he thought, watching Melissa turn another page, the voice everyone is quickest to dismiss is the voice that ends up saving everyone. The end. If Melissa's courage moved you today, don't scroll past without hitting subscribe. Stories like this one are posted every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way out.